Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 22nd of October, 2024. Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. It's great to have you on the show tonight. Thanks very much for taking some time out of your Tuesday evening. And we're going to have a very interesting chat with Leith in a second ago, just a second or so. Before I bring him in, let me just remind you, as I always do, that we don't provide specific financial or legal advice. This is a general conversation only. Please play nice in the chat room, but I encourage you to throw your questions and comments in. And if you would like to get your question top of the list, then use @Walk the World to make sure that I see it. And if you use Super Chat, you can also make sure that your question goes right to the top, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Always greatly appreciated. We do this for importance rather than for profit. So all support is greatly received. Anyway, with that, let me bring Leith in. Hi, Leith. Good to see you once again. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Martin. How about yourself?
Yeah, pretty good. I was away for a few days, enjoying a bit of autumn sunshine here in the UK. Went up various hills and took the dogs all over the place. So been a bit out of the loop, but I still managed to see the PM's big property purchase, the announcements in Melbourne to Zone, to Billio, and a lot of other stupidity going on. I have to tell you that, the more I look at this, the more I feel that the Australian economy and property, frankly, has gone sort of, ooh, what's going on? And hence the title for tonight, are they banking on property to save the economy?
Yeah, I think so. I think they are. I think that the Australian politicians basically run out of any ideas of how to grow the economy without, the Ponzi style growth of high immigration and then obviously growing household debt and property values. So I think we're just bereft of ideas here, and then at the same time we've obviously given ourselves a incredibly expensive energy, which is despite having pretty much everything the world needs except for oil. We've got oodles of gas, coal, iron ore, nickel, lithium, uranium. Basically everything the world needs, Australia is a top 3 exporter in, pretty much, except for oil. And despite that, we've still managed to effectively make ourselves poorer every year, and also make the things that we sell to the rest of the world very expensive at home, which makes us less competitive, i.e. energy. So we're not the brightest lot down under, unfortunately, Martin, and we're ruled by morons, I'm afraid. So nothing's changed since the last time I spoke to you, but I'm sure we could. There have been a few story developments since then, and the idiocy continues.
Well, I was going to say, to my mind, and I've watched and lived in Australia for a long, long time, I always felt that there was huge potential for the country. Right, as you say, because of its resource base and because of the fact that there's just so much opportunity, and we're, Asia and everything else. But it's like every time I look at it, I think they've made another wrong decision. It's almost like every decision is the wrong decision, and I struggle to understand the mentality that drives this. So maybe one of the things we'll try and tease out tonight is a little bit of why this way rather than that way. Part of it, I think, is because of this fixation on property, and we might touch on the fact that politicians tend to have way more properties, particularly investment properties, than ordinary people. Maybe that's something to do with it. It's the same in New Zealand. We might also touch a little bit on the contrast between New Zealand and Australia, because there are some quite interesting points now, and we might touch on some of those things too. And I guess the other interesting observation is that the property story has now become really politicized, because you've now got, the sort of the announceables from the government with regard to various things they say they're going to do, although it doesn't make a lot of difference. And then you've got the other side of politics now making announceables on housing as well. It's like everybody's now sort of cohered around, we've got to solve housing, or we've got to do this on housing. And hence my title tonight, is it really, are they trying to put all the eggs in the property basket again, despite the fact that we've got huge amounts of leverage in property, despite the fact that the ratio of, the average income to property has gone through the roof, property prices are still sky high, we've got massive migration. It's like every lever that you would think they would want to pull one way, they're pulling a different way.
Yeah, and the big narrative now, which has been spread everywhere, is that it's a supply problem. So, it doesn't matter if it's a property industry, you've got the property industry, the politicians, pretty much everyone is trying to paint this as a supply issue. So Australia's just not building enough homes. And the solution here is just to magically conjure up a way to build more homes. And as always, they always ignore the demand side of the equation. The fact that, we've just had the biggest migration boom in history. The last 20 years has been the strongest migration boom in Australia's history. And surprise, surprise, we haven't built enough homes. But, and at the moment, the housing situations on the supply side is absolutely dire. And it's dire for very good reasons, for very good macroeconomic reasons. So we have a situation where they say we've just got to build more homes, but we can't build more homes because of a whole bunch of structural problems. At the same time as they keep having the foot on the pedal with demand through, principally immigration. And we're just setting ourselves up for failure, basically. And, this housing crisis we've got is not going to end anytime soon. We are seeing rents begin to moderate now, asking rent growth, but that's after growth of nearly 40% over the pandemic. So in level terms, they're so much higher than they ever were. But the growth in those rents are now falling, and they're falling for principally two reasons. We've got some evidence has come out that more Australians are moving into group housing. So they're trying to economise on housing costs. At the same time as obviously rents have hit an affordability ceiling. So you, unlike mortgages, you can't leverage rents, which means that it's in the end, rents are tied to what your income is. And we've kind of they've squeezed most of the blood they can out of the renters. And as a result, asking rent growth is now moderating back to sort of more normal levels. But that's after nearly a 40% increase over the pandemic. And so, it's a pretty diabolical situation here. And then, of course, we have politicians from both sides now trying to pander to first home buyers. So you've got Labor doing their Help to Buy scheme, which is basically a shared equity scheme. The coalition wants to liberalise credit so that, first home buyers can borrow more money. And they also want to obviously allow first home buyers to access their super. These are all demand side policies that are just going to push up the price of housing. And they're not addressing the fundamental problem in that prices are just simply too high. And also, I'd argue that the best thing you can do for first home buyers on that front is actually to cut immigration, because immigration adversely impacts, not immigration as a general thing. I'm saying higher excessive levels of immigration, which is what we've got and what we have and what's projected. So I'm not saying we should have zero immigration, but it does need to be cut, because when you run a high immigration program, you put upward pressure on rents, as we've just seen over the last couple of years. That therefore punishes would-be first home buyers, because it makes it harder for them to save a deposit because they're paying more in rent. And then secondly, it punishes them again because it also puts upward pressure on the actual property prices. So if you're a first home buyer under conditions of very high immigration, you're basically stung twice. You're stung on the rental market while you're trying to save up a deposit. And then you're stung when you finally do save up enough of a deposit, when it comes to purchase, the price is higher than it otherwise would have been because of immigration. So you effectively hit twice. And that there is a much bigger issue than all those other concerns around negative gearing and stuff. Negative gearing should be reformed, but negative gearing only impacts prices. It doesn't impact rents. And immigration impacts prices and rents, which is why it's a much worse thing for first home buyers. Because, as I said, when you push up rents, you make it harder to save for a housing deposit, and then you also push up prices as well, whereas negative gearing at least only pushes up prices. So, but yeah, the bottom line is neither party is doing anything serious on the housing front. I'd argue that the coalition's policy is actually slightly better than Labor's. The coalition wants to spend $5 billion to build enabling infrastructure for new housing estates. So, for example, that's your pipes and things that go out to the housing estates, not in the housing estates. And if you don't have those sorts of things like the sewage pipes and that sort of thing, you can't build those estates. But the reason that's not the reason why the coalition's policy is better. The coalition's policy is better because they actually promised to do some decent cuts to immigration, whereas Labor hasn't. So that is the main reason why I think the coalition is actually better on housing, because it has promised to at least cut immigration by a decent amount, whereas Labor Party hasn't. And I think that's why Labor's actually worse on housing. It's more to do with immigration than anything else.
And it's interesting because the latest polls show that two sides are now pretty much line ball in terms of people's support or lack of support for them, which is interesting observation. So one term maybe, who knows?
And can I just add that also? I wish I had the chart up here. It's, whenever I do these things, Martin, I always go, I should have included that. I've got an article going up tomorrow in Macrobusiness about it, but the freshwater poll from the AFR basically looked at voters' views on all these different topics, and what it showed is that the coalition is now substantially ahead of Labor on housing, and it's way ahead on immigration. Yeah. But interestingly, the voters seem to trust the coalition more on housing than they do Labor, which I find pretty interesting. And in that article that's going to go up, I've actually got a tweet from Anthony Albanese in December 2021, so about 6 months before the election, where he was waxing lyrical about how terrible housing affordability is and how hard it is for renters, and how Labor is going to deliver more affordable housing to buy and housing to rent, and et cetera, et cetera. And as we all know, you fast forward 2.5 years later, both of them are the worst. And housing to buy is actually at its most unaffordable level in history, according to PropTrack, and housing to rent is also obviously incredibly unaffordable after these 40% increase in asking rents, roughly. So I think that's why the coalition's ahead, because people just are sick of Labor at the moment, and what's happened to the housing market in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and there's an interesting observation, because in my surveys, I've been tracking the migration out to the west in around Sydney and into those outer suburban areas of Melbourne, and the fact that a lot of the migrants have come into the country and are buying those areas. But the other interesting observation is the lack of local infrastructure in those areas is a huge issue. So people are having to drive a lot further. And finally, the ABC did a show showing, it's on Four Corners, showing the impost of the tolls for getting around, in some cases, 15, 17, 18% of income just paying tolls. And
the transurban, mostly.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another factor that people haven't sort of thought about. The other interesting observation there is that CoreLogic's latest data on the costs of new construction is still rising. Yeah. And of course, the more high-rise you put up, whilst you can still put more on one block of land, the construction costs get ever more because you have to build. You need more materials to build up. So actually, the costs of construction aren't necessarily going to be reduced by building up rather than building out. So it's almost like every time you sort of turn over the stone and think, well, that policy isn't going to help. That policy is not going to help. It's like it's clear that the people who are in charge are either doing this because they need to be seen to be doing something, or they're doing it simply because they genuinely but mistakenly believe it's going to help. And I'm not sure which of the two, but I tend to veer towards the former. I think it's more about trying to show the political story, bearing in mind there's an election sometime ahead, rather than actually wanting to tackle the critical issues. We've said on previous shows, the levers to pull would be to dial back migration, deal with the energy issue by effectively, getting more income than we're currently getting for the energy that we're just allowing to be sucked out overseas. Do those two things, you'd start getting a few things sorted out, because we're not building anything like enough. And even the HIA and everybody else is basically saying we've got to change our mode of operation if we're going to build 1.2 mil.
Yeah, actually, can I just segue on that? That's a very interesting point. So in the last few weeks, at least with regards to New South Wales, there's been a big debate about, obviously building more housing in Sydney and New South Wales. And it started last month with the New South Wales Productivity and Equality Commission. So basically, it used to be called the New South Wales Productivity Commission. They started the term woke when the new Labor government came in, so they added Equality Commission in there. But so the New South Wales Productivity Commission, that's what I'll call them, they released a report last month. And their brainiac solution to New South Wales's housing crisis, really Sydney's housing crisis, was to basically deregulate apartment construction, so that you can, so that there are no limits on apartment heights, no limits on apartment sizes, no limits on balcony sizes. You can have apartments with less storage, no car parks, and getting rid of requirements on natural light. So basically, they want to build dog kennels, right? And that was their Brainiac solution to improving housing affordability in Sydney. And the New South Wales Productivity Commission said that if we did all that stuff, rents could be 10% lower. So you're going to do all this stuff. You're going to force people to live in high-rise dog kennels, basically, which are super high, super small, have bugger all storage, tiny balconies, hardly any natural light, and no car park for a 10% improvement in rental affordability. It's stone raving barking mad what they suggested. And here's the other one, Martin. They then said one of the reasons why New South Wales can't build enough homes, and in fact, governments across Australia, we can't build enough homes, is because state governments are spending too much on infrastructure, and that's diverting resources and labour away from home building. And I look at that and I go, hang on, if we're going to have a growing population, so Australia's population is officially predicted to grow by another 13.1 million people in the next 29 years, right? That's like adding another Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane to Australia's current population in just 39 years. If we're going to do that, we're going to need a hell of a lot of housing and a hell of a lot of infrastructure. You can't have one or the other. You got to have both. And unfortunately, New South Wales Productivity Commission thinks that we can magically stop spending on infrastructure to support all the massive migration we've got and just divert it into housing. This was repeated last week by the New South Wales Treasurer, Daniel Mookhey, who said the same thing. And Mervac also reiterated that and said we got to build less infrastructure and divert it to housing. But then here's the kicker: the Committee of Sydney then came out with an opposing report saying that if Sydney's going to meet its housing targets, it needs an enormous amount of metro stations built. It was like dozens and dozens of like a dozen new metro train lines or something, which is going to be obviously unaffordable. Right? How are you going to build a dozen tunnels for new train lines across Sydney? How much is that going to cost? And obviously, if we do that, you're going to have less resources and labour to build houses. So we're stuck in a catch-22 here. The federal government wants to crush load Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, etc., major cities in Australia with immigration through the moon. 13.1 million people in 39 years. And now they're sort of arguing with themselves about, do we build housing or do we build infrastructure? I've got news for you guys. You've got to do both, because if you don't do both, we're stuffed. And here's the other thing. The Brainiac solution, as the New South Wales Productivity Commission said, was to stuff everyone into high-rise kennels without natural light and all that sort of thing. Well, what did we do end of last decade? So between 2015 and 2019, we built a hell of a lot of high-rise dog boxes in Sydney and Melbourne mostly. And they end up, 60% of Sydney's recent apartment complexes have had serious problems, like serious faults, according to New South Wales government's own report. So that was when that was our last construction boom. We built masses of apartments that ended up having flammable cladding, leaking balconies, foundation problems, all those sorts of things. They end up being very poorly built. Yet our governments now are ignoring that whole situation of what happened at last decade when we had a boom, and they want to double the boom, like have an even bigger boom of apartments and high-rise shoeboxes. What do you think is going to happen if we build so many apartments so quickly to meet this mass immigration policy of the federal government? We're just going to repeat the same mistakes again. You're going to cut, corners are going to be cut. We're going to have very poor quality, and we're going to have all the same problems we had last decade when we did the same thing, except this time it's going to be worse because they wanted even more of it. Like, this is just madness that the government had, the government, state governments and federal have in store for us, when the optimal solution, it's not rocket science, is to dramatically slow immigration back to levels it was, the mid 2000s, under 120,000 a year net overseas migration. That way, you don't have to turn everything into high rise. You don't have to build everything so quickly. You can build enough infrastructure to meet that sort of population growth. And we don't have to have all these stupid problems that they want to foist upon us. And it's not going to cost nearly as much, because we're not going to have to build dozens of metro lines and all the other infrastructure that has to go along with this, which are really a cost of immigration. That is the optimal solution here. Like, why do we want Sydney to be 8.5 million people by 2060, Melbourne to be 9.5 million people? they're big enough as they are already. I'd argue that Melbourne was better 10, 20 years ago than it is now. And I live in Melbourne, and probably the same for Sydney. So why are we continuing to go down this stupid road that has delivered lower living standards for 20 years, wrecked productivity across their country, and just created all these problems? Like, what is the logical sense of continuing this madness? And in fact, not just continuing it, doubling down and, doing it on steroids. It's just going to lead to even worse outcomes than we've just had for the past 20 years.
Absolutely. And specifically, of course, in Melbourne, they've now announced, is it 50 zones for high rise?
Yep.
That's the phase one. There's more to follow, right? Where they're essentially saying, you can build up, feel free to, to build up. And the interesting observation, which of course I come back to, is this. If you build up a lot more in the central areas and slightly out from there, one of the things you're going to need is a hell of a lot more power and a lot more water. Now, those are infrastructure projects, as well as potentially more people with more traffic in those same area, infrastructure projects. So it's not an either or, as you absolutely say. The other interesting observation is how many people really want to live in these dog boxes. Certainly in my surveys, quite a few people say, well, I'm living in this environment now with huge amounts of noise from my neighbours. I can't get around. It's like we're devaluing the quality of life. Now, it's worth also saying, I think, that some of the other people who've come into the country more recently are actually perhaps more willing and able to live in these environments because they've been used to it from where they've come from. But for people who've lived in Australia for a long period of time, this is a complete change in lifestyle, it seems to me.
Yeah, and it's a massive degradation of lifestyle. Let's be honest.
Mm.
I mean, we are facing a situation where every generation that comes from now on is going to have worse housing conditions than their parents. That's the reality of it. I mean, I think I'm 46, so I'm a Gen Xer, and I'm probably the last generation to have good housing. I'm talking as a generalization for the generation. There's always going to be people who've got good housing and those who don't, wealthier, etc. But, whose housing was commensurate with what my parents had, even though it cost me more money than what they paid. But at least it's ended up being commensurate. But my kids aren't going to enjoy the same housing I've got. There's just no way. Unless I can stump them up a couple $1 million for them. But, if you're someone starting out now, you're facing a much worse situation your parents had. And I think our grandchildren are going to have even worse situation.
Yeah.
And that's a process that they've put us on here. And again, I might sound like a broken record, but I think a lot of this does come down to immigration, because I live in Melbourne, and at the turn of the century, Melbourne had 3.5 million people. It took us 170 years to get to 3.5 million people. And in just 24 years, we've added another 1.9 million. So we've added an enormous amount, over 50% in just 24 years. But here's the thing, Martin, like Victorian government's official forecasts are for Melbourne to be 9 million people by 2056. So if you think about it, it took us 170 years to grow by 3.5 million people. And then in 56 years, we're going to grow by an additional 5.5 million people. How does that work? Like, how can you possibly accommodate 5.5 million people's worth of growth in 56 years? It's just not possible. So that's the reality of the situation here. And all it means is that if we do get there, if we do meet their official projection, it's just going to be high-rise shoeboxes, because that's all that we'll be able to do. We're going to have to basically shoehorn in massive amounts of high-rise to accommodate that surge in population. And the reason why it's going to be high-rise, people often say, we just need to build low density. The problem with it is it's very hard to do low density when you need that much volume, because you've got to wait for someone to sell their place, right? So if I sold my place and they decided to turn it into a duplex, for example, so I'm on a 780 square metre block and single house. If they want to turn it into a double, they're going to wait for me to sell, and then they're going to, you can build 2 townhouses, right? And there's a lot of those going up in my area, and they're actually really good because they're still good sized blocks, etc. Got backyards, whatever. It's good. But you can't meet that level of population growth by doing that, which is why we're getting these high rises. It's the path of least resistance, where you can grab a lot and just stuff hundreds of apartments on that lot, very poor quality shoeboxes, etc. And that's the way they're going to do it, to try and meet this 5.5 million population growth in 56 years. That's the reality of it. And it's similar in Sydney. Like Sydney's dwelling composition, I've actually got a great chart here. It's worth, I might put on, but that's all right if you switch across. So on the right-hand side here, the dwelling composition, the far right chart, it shows that this is from Urban Task Force. 55% of Sydney's dwellings in the 2016 census were detached housing, and only 30% were apartments. But by 2057, that's what's projected, half of Sydney's dwellings are going to be apartments, and only 25% are going to be detached houses. Now, that to me looks like a complete transformation of Sydney in a relatively short period of time. So about 40 years. You're going to go from basically being mostly detached housing to mostly apartments and then townhouses. So this is really what we want here, and it's going to be similar in Melbourne. And if Brisbane follows us, they're going to have the same problems. It's just really what we want here. That's the thing. And to your point on costs, there was a development in Box Hill in Melbourne. It's called the Vicinity Centres. And I'm just pulling this out as an example because it was touted in the Age as, these 20 to 40 story towers going up in Box Hill. And basically, it's going to be 1,700 apartments. And when you actually divide the project cost by the number of apartments, it works out at $923,000, $529 per apartment. Now, that to me and this is for 2-bedroom apartments, right? So that's the cost of building them, which means there's going to be markup on those as well when they sell them. So you're going to be looking at over $1 million for a 2-bedroom apartment to live in the middle suburbs of Melbourne. Now, I don't think that's affordable. So the solution here, the governments are saying, we'll just build apartments everywhere. That'll improve affordability, etc. It's like, well, no, it's not, because here we have a project in Box Hill in Melbourne, which is the middle ring suburb. It's not, close into town. And the cost of building all these 2-bedroom apartments, predominantly 2-bedroom apartments, is I think there's a couple of 1-bedrooms and a few, 3 bedrooms or whatever. But the average would be 2 bedrooms. Ends up at $924,000 to build each apartment, which means they'll probably end up selling for 1.2 million or whatever once they do markup and all the other stuff. That's not affordable housing. And it's certainly not as good as what we used to have when you could live in a detached house for cheaper. And this is the future. And the crazy thing is, so the Victorian government announced that they're going to, rezone 50 areas for 20-story apartments, etc. And Carter Chet Kramer, which is an analyst group, came out and said that it won't boost supply because unless apartment prices go up by 15%, because it's not profitable now for developers to build apartments in Melbourne unless the prices rise by 15% because of and this is all gets down to the massive surge in construction costs we've had since the pandemic, whereby construction costs have gone up by circa, nearly 40%. And because of that, builders can't build apartments profitably, at current prices. So in order to be profitable, apartment prices have to go up by 15%. But Carter Chet Kramer then said, but if apartment prices go up by 15%, it'll be above what most buyers are willing or able to pay. And that there is the conundrum we have here. The governments want to increase housing supply, but they can't because the cost of building has gone up so much. So effectively, we've had the housing supply curve, which is the chart on the left here, has shifted to the left. So any of you who've studied basic economics, we've had this huge increase in input costs. So roughly 40% since the pandemic. We've got a shortage of labour now because thousands of home builders have gone broke. They've gone out of business. So we've got less capacity. And also builders are competing with state governments and big build infrastructure projects. And also we have structurally higher interest rates now than we did during the last apartment boom in 2017 when we hit the last record construction. So what this effectively means is that the housing supply curve has shifted left. And what that means is that the price of producing homes has gone up at every tier, and we can't build as much. So therefore, if we can't build as much because costs have gone up, and we're going to, the only solution to our dilemma to solve the housing crisis has to be on the demand side. And it's got to be through cutting immigration. So we've got to lower immigration to a level that is commensurate with the nation's ability to build homes and infrastructure. And at the moment, it's so far above that, which is why we have these faux debates from governments and the industry and whatever saying, oh, no, we've got to build less infrastructure so we can build more housing. And then you got the Committee of Cities saying, no, we need to build more infrastructure to allow more housing. Well, guess what, guys? You can't have both. And we've got a structurally impaired housing market, which cannot build as much housing as it could before, and it's too expensive. So therefore, you've got to cut demand. Because if you don't cut demand, this problem is just going to keep getting worse. It's as simple as that. And rezoning stuff for high-rise is not going to solve the problem when that high-rise costs a fortune to build already, and you got mobs like Carter Check Kramer saying that the apartment price has to go up another 15% just to make it profitable for developers to even try and build those apartments. Because if they don't, it's not profitable, so they're not going to build them. That is the vicious cycle that we're in at the moment.
And let me add to that, because of course the other strategy is this idea of building to rent as well. And Cameron Murray's done some quite good work on that, showing that the typical cost of those build to rent properties, because they often will have swimming pools and other things as part of them as well, means that those costs are even higher. So effectively, the build to rent story is not going to solve the property story either, and instead going to make things cheaper. It's so the levers are not the right levers, are they?
No, they're not. And I'd argue that build to rent's actually pretty bad, because all you're doing is you're going to add a corporate layer into what is already a gigantic rent-seeking industry, property. And we've seen what happens when you corporatize things across all these other areas of the economy. You end up just getting these profit maximizing firms gouging us even harder. And I fail to see how these private investment funds and whatever are going to build to rent are going to magically create more affordable housing. They're going to use their market power to just basically gouge us even more.
Yeah,
because it's going to be an easy way to extract rents out of us. And so this whole notion that build to rent's the new savior, it's a new gimmick. As Cam Murray's pointed out, and there's been a whole bunch of reports in the AFR and other places, your typical build-to-rent project rents out at 20% higher than comparable rentals in the same areas. So they're 15 to 20% higher. So they're actually more expensive. So it's actually a solution that's probably going to make housing more expensive. Again, it's another gimmick. Our politicians just love gimmicks. And they love, so the whole, zoning utopia is one of the gimmicks they use. They try and, as I said, they paint it as a supply problem, and really it's an excessive demand problem. I mean, to be sure, there are supply barriers at the moment. There's a lot of supply barriers. As I said, residential construction costs have gone up. We've got higher interest rates. A whole bunch of building firms have gone bust. Builders competing for labour against big build infrastructure projects, all those sorts of things. They are legitimate supply issues, but they're not going to be solved magically. And they're certainly not an issue of planning, of zoning. They're completely unrelated to zoning. And this is why, this whole notion, I would just zone everything for high rise and that'll fix it, is not going to fix it, because it's a cost issue. It's a supply, the supply curve has shifted to the left. And it's now more expensive to build a given amount of housing than it was before. Therefore, you build less of it, and there's less demand for it from buyers because they can't afford it. That is the situation we've got. And the only way to bring back equilibrium, which is what economists love to talk about, in the housing market when your demand curve shifts left, is you got to reduce demand. You have to reduce demand to bring price back down to where it was. And that means you got to lower immigration or lower population demand. That's the only thing you can do. So this whole notion that, we just zone everything for high rise, she'll be right, mate. It won't be right. We're not going to have affordable housing, and we're going to have worse quality housing, as we saw at the end of last decade when we had a construction boom and we built a whole bunch of faulty, crappily built apartments that we're still paying for today. And the government wants to do this all over again. They never learn from their mistakes. That was an absolute cluster, when we built that stuff last decade. And the government wants to just repeat it on steroids this time around to backfill an immigration boom that we should never have had, and we do not need, and Australians don't want. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, and it's worth reflecting here, I think, on the Auckland story, right? Because New Zealand was a little bit ahead of doing some of this, and of course, if you look at the story of Auckland, there's a lot of high rise gone on there, but that hasn't played out quite as well as people hoped it might. And to my mind, that's a bit of an object lesson, because it's not necessarily going to reach the outcomes that the politicians are aspiring to. I'd also make the point, a lot of the politicians are very close to some of these large construction companies, and I wonder to what extent the game of mates is also in play as well.
Yeah, that's right. And just to your point on Auckland, there's actually a better example, Martin. There's actually Vancouver. So I wish I had the charts in here from Vancouver, but it's often, I've written articles on it. It's amazing. So Vancouver, over basically a 30-year period, has completely transformed itself from like a low-rise city into an absolute high-rise Hong Kong-style jungle, right? And it is rezoned all sorts of stuff. It's built high-rise towers everywhere. Like the before and after photos are quite astonishing when you look at it, of what it was like in the late 90s versus now. And the sad reality is, though, Vancouver's still got the most expensive housing in North America. So it's got the highest prices. It has the highest rents in Canada by far, despite doing this YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, high-rise construction. Like, it's literally transformed the city into a high-rise Hong Kong-style city. And yet it hasn't achieved affordable housing. Arguably, it's gotten worse. I'm not saying it's gotten worse because of the high-rise, but it certainly hasn't gotten better by building high-rise. Again, it's got the most expensive houses in North America, and it also has the most expensive rents in Canada. Now, I don't know, not sure if it's the most expensive in North America rents, but certainly in Canada, Vancouver is by far the most expensive jurisdiction. And about 75% of Vancouver's housing construction has been high-rise for decades. So it's turned into a high-rise city. It's doing what our governments want us to do now. It's done that already for multiple decades with absolutely deplorable results. It hasn't improved the situation in Canada. It hasn't improved affordability. Rental affordability has gotten worse, and price affordability has gotten worse. So this is a solution that is not going to work. And yet it's been thrust upon us, and they want to completely transform the way we live. For what? Just so they can keep shoveling in hundreds of thousands of new migrants every year into our cities. Well, who asked for this? I didn't. And again, I'll say, do we really want Australia to grow by another 13.1 million people in the next 39 years? Again, just to put that into perspective, that's like adding another Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane to Australia's current population in just 39 years. That's an insane amount of population growth. And a lot of that's going to land on Sydney, or Melbourne, and then Sydney and Brisbane. So, who wants this stuff? And it does make you wonder, it's the reason why the politicians are all behind this. Is that because they've got their fingers in the pie? And if you don't mind switching back, Martin, this is probably a good segue to the topic of, our federal parliamentarians. So the ABC did a report last week. This is after Albo bought his, $4.5 million mansion in beachfront mansion, whatever it was, in Copacabana. They did this investigation. And look, I'll just say the reason why I think, just as an aside, my biggest issue with Albo buying his Copacabana beachfront, holiday pad isn't so much the purchase. I think it's, very poorly timed when you got a housing crisis to do something like that. But the bigger issue I've got with it is that he announced, in June this year, that they'll spend $100 million to fix up the road leading to his Copacabana mansion. So effectively, he's using taxpayer money. He announced this before he bought it, but he obviously announced it knowing that he was going to buy this property. That if you join the dots, that's the bigger issue here. He's spending $100 million of taxpayers' money to effectively improve the road going to his property, which is going to increase the value of his property. So I think that's the biggest issue scandal here with Albo's purchase. But back to the point, the ABC did an investigation of federal parliamentarians and have found that the home ownership rate of federal parliamentarians is about 95%. And this compares to 66% for all Australians. And that's skewed higher by obviously retirees, which have a home ownership rate of around 70%, and younger people have much less. Now, interestingly, of the 227 sitting MPs, only 12 have no property ownership. 67 own a single property. 71 own two properties. And here's the kicker. 77 of our parliamentarians, so roughly a third, own three or more properties. So, if you ever wonder why, our politicians always do policies to, boost house prices, it's probably not a bad idea to follow the money, I'd say, especially the 77 of them there who are portfolio property owners. Interesting stuff, I would have thought.
And fascinating, same in New Zealand as well. There was a report done a couple of years ago showing that the politicians in New Zealand had significantly larger property portfolios than the average New Zealander. And, again, it comes back to the aligned interests, right? If you've got portfolio properties, then the last thing you want is your property portfolio to go down. The last thing you want is to reduce the tax breaks that you can get on them. And, of course, the alibi that they will use is GDP growth requires more people, because if we can actually have more people, we can keep the GDP growing. That means we don't get a recession, and nobody marks us up for not having a recession. They'll mark us down if we do have a recession. So, there is this sort of weird narrative, right? But the net effect of all this on ordinary Australians is it's harder and harder to afford to buy a property. And if you do afford to buy one, you're going to be much more leveraged up, or you'll need to borrow money from parents or get a gift from parents, the bank of mum and dad, or now the grandparents are kicking in as well. So the winners, let's be clear, the winners are politicians, the construction industry, and the banks, because, of course, the leverage model means the banks are now sitting on ever bigger mortgage pools. And in fact, the trend in mortgage growth over the last year or so has been absolutely ridiculous, particularly in the investment side. Is that 35% or something nutty? And you got to say, well, how come the vested interests seem to be winning and ordinary Australians seem to be losing? There's something wrong here.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's like that on everything. It's like that across the board, unfortunately. Whether it's energy or just on the energy thing. I mean, this is similar to housing. We've got the gas giants, so the foreign-owned gas companies now, are saying, Australia's East Coast Australia is going to face a gas shortage. We need to import gas. We need to do import terminals now. That's the latest thing, and so we are seriously in a situation where Australia is about to have floating LNG import terminals now in Port Phillip Bay in Melbourne, and potentially New South Wales, to now import our own gas. When we literally on the East Coast, we sell nearly 3/4 of it overseas, and 3/4 of what we sell on the East Coast goes to China, who is now literally burning off its own gas, like it's flaring its own gas because it's got too much of it. Now, I'm not saying the gas is flaring as Australian gas, but and China's actually re-exporting gas as well. So it's getting it from us on the cheap on long-term contracts, and it's literally re-exporting it for profit and burning off its excess gas, while us at home are being starved of gas, even though we export nearly 3/4 of it. It's just madness. And then the brainiac solution now is to build an import terminal, which from an environmental perspective, this is just so moronic, because Australia literally uses more gas to freeze it to convert it to liquid than we do actually all households, then do all households use. So I've got a chart here just to show that, Martin, actually. This is from last time. Now, this is an East Coast gas. This is Australia-wide gas. But it's the same story. So LNG export terminals use 7.3% of Australia's gas. So this is East and West Coast. 82% of our gas, East and West Coast, is exported, right? Now, residential, we only use 2.6% of Australia's gas. So just think about that for a second. The export terminals are literally using 7.3% of our gas just to freeze it. So they've got to, freeze it to minus however many 100 degrees. Takes a hell of a lot of energy to put it onto an LNG ship, which is like a massive gas tanker, with liquefied gas. Then they've got to ship it halfway across the world to China, who then degasses it to use there. So it's an incredibly wasteful process, and it uses a lot of energy. And we're using roughly 3 times as much gas to put it on a ship to export than all of Australian households use in their own gas. And we're actually using more gas to convert to liquid for export than we use to fire gas powered plants. We use 6.2% of Australia's gas on gas peakers, which are used for electricity generation. And again, we burn off 7.3% to convert to liquid. Now, from an environmental perspective, this is terrible because exporting gas, it'd be a lot better for the environment if we simply exported less and just burnt it at home, because you wouldn't lose this wasteful process of having to convert it into liquid. You burn off 7.3% of it, as I said. You lose 7% of your gas just to export it. And then you wouldn't have to put it on a ship and burn how much diesel or whatever to then transport it halfway across the world to somewhere. It'd be better for the environment, and it'd be better for us if we just simply used it ourselves. And, this is the thing. We've got an artificial shortage on the East Coast. The solutions that they're coming up with is to build import terminals, when the real solution is to simply cancel a couple of contracts with China. Again, they're getting too much bloody gas. They're getting more than they need. Cancel a few of the contracts, declare force majeure on them, change a government policy. China might kick up a bit of a stink, but who cares? Like they've already stuffed us on a lot of our exports, lobsters and wine and all the other stuff, and use it ourselves. And basically put in a domestic reservation policy like they have in WA, and then regulate the price using cost plus pricing. So if it costs $3 to pull it out of the ground, well, you can only charge $4. You get a 33% markup. And that would pretty much solve our gas shortage and also make electricity cheap. And now I know there's going to be some people listening to this going, oh, no, but Leith, you don't understand. The Victorian gas is running out, and most of the gas is in Queensland. And, we've got to pipe it down to Victoria, and the pipeline's congested. We can't, it's at capacity over winter. That's true. It is. During the winter months, for a couple of months of the year, gas demand is ahead of what the gas demand in the southern states is more than what the pipeline can accommodate from Queensland. But that's easy to get around. You build a few storage terminals like they're doing everywhere else in the world. The US uses them, UK, Europe uses them. You build a few storage tanks. You fill up the storage tanks over summer when gas demand is less because nobody's heating, and then you use them in winter. Just like when you go and fill up your barbecue in wintertime for your barbecue, you go to fill up your tank, and then you burn it off in summer when you have barbecues. That's all Australia needs to do. And if we did that, we'd have cheap domestic gas like they do in West Coast in Western Australia, and then we'd also have cheap electricity because gas sets the electricity price. The national energy market works. So it basically calculates the bids every hour for electricity. And because gas is used as the peaking fuel, which means it's used as the top-up fuel, when that's expensive, it pushes up the whole price of electricity, which is one of the reasons why on the East Coast here, electricity prices have gone through the roof, whereas in Western Australia, they haven't, because Western Australia has cheap gas. And Western Australia has actually gotten off coal quicker than us because they're now using gas instead because it's cheap and it's plentiful. And that's basically what we could do on the East Coast here. It'd improve cost of living because we'd have lower energy costs. Our manufacturing would become more competitive because, again, lower input costs, and we'd have lower inflation, other things equal, because we wouldn't have this cost push inflation from energy filtering through the economy and pushing up inflation everywhere. none of this is rocket science, but unfortunately, it's another area where we are getting absolutely shafted by our politicians who are captured and seem to care more about, our multinational companies. They also seem to care more about hurting the feelings of China and Japan, who we sell our gas to, despite the fact that both those nations are getting more gas than they need, and they're actually re-exporting it for profit while we're starving ourselves at home. It's just insane. And I'm not sure I talked about this last time, but former independent senator for South Australia, Rex Patrick, did a freedom of information request on a proposed domestic reservation policy for the East Coast. So, as it turned out, the former coalition government under Morrison was looking into domestic reservation on the East Coast, and they held an inquiry, and that paper was delivered in December 2021, so a couple of months before the election, and it never got released. So it was options it was basically entitled options for East Coast gas reservation, and Rex Patrick did a request to get that released publicly. They refused. He then spent, I think it was $1,200 of his own money to take it to the Minister of Appeals Tribunal. A whole bunch of lawyers from the government then fought him to not release the paper. And the reasons for not releasing the paper was that if it gets out that the East Coast was looking at reserving gas, it could hurt the feelings of our Japanese and of our Asian customers, which is just absurd. So they literally and the bureaucrats in the energy department advised against reservation because they said that Australia must be a reliable supplier of gas, and it would harm the people that we sell our gas to. So it would harm our customers in Asia who reserve gas, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, they care more about the welfare of residents in other countries and the feelings of these other countries than they do about their own constituents in Australia who are getting absolutely slaughtered with high energy costs and who they're meant to represent. Like, our politicians are elected to represent us, but they're actually representing foreign, energy firms and foreign customers. It's just, it's high treason, basically. But these are the idiots that we have running the country. And it's the same, it's the same in housing, it's the same in energy, it's the same everywhere. Where basically we're ruled by unrepresentative swill who care more about, non-Australians and the welfare of, multinational companies, etc., than they do about the average Australian who actually elects them. It's crazy. That's the situation we've got. And it is the polar opposite of what Norway does. Norway taxes its energy exports at effectively about 80%. So some of them are obviously, a lot of is publicly owned, but even the private sector, energy companies are taxed at a really high rate. And as a result, Norwegians have they get massive amounts of tax revenue from their energy resources. The government then has invested in a sovereign wealth fund that invests overseas. So they're actually the biggest shareholder of Microsoft, for example. And this sovereign wealth fund's worth about $290,000 US per Norwegian. So it's a massive endowment fund that's worth huge amounts of money. It can basically fund Norway forever. And us in Australia, we don't do any of this stuff. We don't tax our energy properly. We don't get enough tax revenue from it. We then allow them to charge us ridiculously high prices for our own resources, which then pushes up the cost of electricity as well. And then we end up, Australia's basically turned what was a comparative advantage in low-cost energy into a disadvantage. And we've actually shot ourselves in the foot by giving ourselves some of the most expensive energy prices in the world, which has then made our industry less competitive than it otherwise would be. When, as I said at the start of the show, Australia has almost everything that the world needs except for oil. We've got oodles of gas, coal, iron ore, lithium, nickel, uranium, you name it. We are a top 3 exporter top 3 or 4 exporter in every one of those products. We should be the richest country on earth. We should be an absolute superpower, given that we have what the rest of the world needs, but we don't really have anything to show for it. And this is just an absolute failure of government policy here. They don't care about us. And, you know, we're effectively getting poorer. If you took out the fake wealth from housing, I mean, what do we have to show for it? It's just crazy. So, you know, this is the unfortunate situation we find ourselves in.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting that Cookie a little while ago put this up. The world, according to Cook, we're the richest nation in the world. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And the fact is, you know, the basic DNA of Australia means that we should be right up there. But the truth is that if you look at ordinary Australians and you know, their balance sheets, well, real wages growth over the last couple of decades has gone absolutely nowhere. Inflation has been raging. The costs of energy, as we've described, thanks to the gas problem, have gone through the roof. And of course, the other side of this is we now know that the supermarkets have been helping themselves quite nicely to sort of margin improvement. We know that insurance companies like Suncorp, for example, that was in the press recently, have been charging like a wounded bull. So wherever you look, it looks to me as though the buck is actually stopping with ordinary households whose real world living standards are being diluted. Now, there are some are doing fine, clearly. Not everybody's in the same boat. But, you know, the bulk of Australians, either in the rental sector or in the mortgage sector, are finding it really tough at the moment. And I guess that the interesting observation is that they voted Labor in, you know, one term ago. I don't think Labor's done a great job of helping people out. They're chucking a little bit of money at them, you know, the $300 energy subsidy. But my observation on that is that that's not really helping. And in fact, Michelle Bullock looks through it in terms of any inflation adjustment. So there seems to be a disconnect between what politicians are saying and what they're actually doing and the results for ordinary people.
Yeah, and if you don't mind switching across, I mean that's perfectly encapsulated in the, you know, per capita data here. So, you know, obviously Australia's avoided a technical recession because we've had nearly 2.5% population growth. So, you know, it's pretty hard to have a recession when you grow your population like a science experiment. But, you know, per capita, we've had six consecutive quarters of per capita GDP decline, or 7 of the past 8 quarters. And more importantly is the chart on the right. That's real per capita household disposable income. And that's actually fallen by about 8% over 2 years. So from June 2022, when the Albanese government came in, to June 2024, it's fallen by about 8%. Now, that's the biggest fall in history, in Australia's history. It also happens to be one of the biggest falls in the world. I mean, Michael Reid at the AFR did an assessment against a whole bunch of OECD countries. I think he did the top 25 countries or something. And Australia had the biggest decline in real per capita household disposable income out of every country. So we were literally ranked the worst. Now, I'm sure there's some countries somewhere which have, you know, done worse. But the point is that we literally had, you know, one of, if not the biggest declines of real per capita household disposable income since Labor got in. So, you know, it's not great. It's not a great situation. And to your point on the energy thing, yeah, sure. Labor's thrown us a couple $100 for energy, et cetera, but that is actually spending our tax money to effectively try and cover up the gas cartel's gouging. And it's not solving the underlying problem. And I'd argue it's actually worse, because what you're effectively doing is you're effectively giving money straight to the gas cartel. Because it's a bit like what's going on in New South Wales. So the state government gives rebates on tolls, right? So I can't remember how much it is, but, you know, they give, it's worth millions of dollars every year. I think tens of millions in toll rebates. Well, that money ends up just going straight in the pockets of Transurban. So it's making, you know, Transurban loves it because people use the toll roads more than they otherwise would. And because, you know, the government's picking up some of the cost, i.e. taxpayers. And therefore, it just fattens the wallet of Transurban. And well, it's kind of the same with the energy subsidies. Instead of solving the underlying problem, which is you force the gas producers to supply, to reserve gas, and that might mean they have to break some contracts. Well, so be it. When they opened up the Gladstone LNG terminals in the mid last decade, the gas cartel companies said they had enough gas to do both. Well, they lied. They didn't have enough gas. And they ended up sucking gas out of the domestic market to try and meet its export contracts. They signed too many contracts. They took on too much. And then they've ended up, basically shafting domestic users. Well, that was on them. And so force domestic reservation, implement some price cap regulation, old-fashioned price cap regulations where, you can get a modest return on the gas that you sell domestically. If it costs you $3 to pull it out of the ground, you can charge $4. That's it per gigajoule. That'd cut the cost of East Coast gas by 2/3 roughly. And Bob's your uncle. Build a few storage tanks down south to fill up over the summer months using the north-south pipeline, and then it's there for winter. And that's exactly what the US does. The US has states that produce gas, other states that don't. It has it fills up storage facilities, etc., over summer to use in winter. And Americans pay, $2 to $2.50 US per gigajoule of gas. And they are the biggest exporter in the world. They've overtaken us. So the US sells the most gas in the world. They pay about $4 Australian for their gas. And they have storage tanks and all those sorts of things to fill up in summer to use in winter. Because otherwise their pipelines will be over capacity during wintertime when everyone needs it. Just copy them. It's not rocket science. America's got domestic gas reservation. It works differently to Western Australia, but they've got it. Or copy Western Australia and then do some storage tanks. Like, that's all we have to do. It's not rocket science. We could deliver cheap energy very easily, especially given that we sell nearly 3/4 of it, of East Coast gas. And as I showed before, we burn off 7% of our gas just to put on a ship to send to China. Like, it's just insane. But the idiot solution here from the industry and politicians is instead of fixing the underlying problem here, we'll either give rebates like the federal government's done, or we'll build import terminals so that we can freeze gas, put on a ship, turn the ship south, or from Western Australia, whatever, and then ship it down to Victoria into Port Phillip Bay, degasify it, and then burn it here at exorbitant prices. This is just so backward, and it's so environmentally destructive because that whole process of liquefaction to turn into liquid, as I said, burns over 7% of your gas. You use 7% of your gas just to do that. So you lose 7% efficiency when you can just burn it directly without doing any of that stuff. And it's just everything is backwards in this country, unfortunately.
Absolutely. Well, I'll talk about backwards. Just to re-emphasize what we said, Marcus said, I've been reading the Treasury macroeconomic model, and looks to me population growth is built in to the assumption to grow the GDP. Any comment? Spot on. Yeah. It is. That is the fundamental point, that there is no growth other than more people. That's the problem.
Yeah. And unfortunately, their stupid model also. So a couple of years ago, I attacked that model, saying that. So they basically argued that immigration has a really good impact on the federal budget, which it does. So the federal budget collects 80% of the nation's tax revenue, 82%, I think is the exact figure. Nation's tax revenue. So when you increase immigration, the federal budget gets a big boost because you have more taxpayers paying personal income tax, and then you also have obviously more company tax from that, which goes to the feds. So they love it. And the feds don't pay all the costs of immigration because a lot of that's borne by the states. So all your extra, healthcare and infrastructure spending and most of your services and all that stuff is picked up by the states, right? So the feds can cost shift the cost of immigration to the states while they get most of the benefits. So they love it. Now, I attacked the intergenerational report, etc., saying, well, you go on about how great it is for the federal budget. What about state budgets? They're all drowning in debt. Like, they're all the amount of debt they're going into to fund the big build infrastructure, which is purely to keep up with immigration. It's put in massive amounts of debt. Now, the Treasury then pulled out this absolute BS model which tried to argue that immigration is good for state budgets as well. And it was the biggest, like I went through it and was like, oh my God, wrote an article in Macrobusiness ripping it apart. And the idiocy of it, like, so if you use an example, the suburban rail loop in Melbourne is got to be the worst infrastructure project I've ever seen. So it's estimated to cost $200 billion for all three stages over, 20 odd years, whatever it is to build it. It's an absolute boondoggle. And the whole justification for building this $200 billion model by the state government is Melbourne is going to grow to 9 million people. Therefore, we need this rail loop to accommodate that population growth. So I read that as we need this project to cope with immigration. So to me, that project should be a cost of immigration, right? Now, the way this BS Treasury model works is it attributes the cost of infrastructure on a pro rata basis. So it's ridiculous. So, for example, if a piece of infrastructure costs $100 million, the way the Treasury works it out is they go, 30% of Australians are foreign born, therefore 30% of that $100 billion is a cost of immigration, which is just farcical. So they effectively, because of 30% of Australians are foreign born, only 30% of the cost of infrastructure gets attributed to migrants. When really it should be close to 100%, because the only reason why you'd build a suburban rail loop and the whole justification for it is because of immigration, because Melbourne's going to grow to 9 million people. It's the same with this Committee of Sydney report that says that Sydney's got to build, I can't even remember what it is, dozens of metro lines or whatever to accommodate its population surge. Well, if you didn't have immigration, you wouldn't have to build any. So therefore, they are all a cost of immigration. But this Treasury model only attributes 30% of that cost to immigration. So therefore 70% of it goes on the incumbent population. Therefore, immigration is good for state budgets, according to their modelling. It's just absurd. Like, it doesn't pass the laugh test. But this is the sort of stuff that Treasury does to cheat the stats. And this is the modelling that's going to go into the next intergeneration report. And guess who co-authored the report with Treasury? The Grattan Institute, those guys, the hucksters, the puppeteers of the Scanlon Foundation. So, which is set up by by a property developer. So, it's just, you just follow the money everywhere, and it's a joke. And I'd argue that the Australian Treasury is actually one of the biggest lobby groups, because again, it gets down to this: the Treasury collects 80% of the nation's tax revenue. It privatizes all the benefits of immigration and socializes the costs on the states and on us private individuals. They're going to then pay for toll roads and all this other stuff that ends up costing us heaps of money.
Absolutely. Well, I've often said the trouble is that, ordinary people are being left pick up the pieces. Highest tax take ever. All of those things. That's another very important point to note, that if you look at the inflation pressures and the tax pressures are actually more significant on most households than the inflationary pressures over the last few years. And that's another thing that nobody really wants to talk about. But as we come to the end of the show, one last thing to explore, and that is inflation, right? So inflation is coming down a little. And there's a bit of a sort of a debate now as to whether the Reserve Bank is likely to cut soon. And of course, inflation has come down, but it's not really within band. We never put our cash rates as high as some other countries. And so we're in this sort of nether region where, in fact, inflation's still a bit strong. Maybe the Reserve Bank won't be able to take the interest rates down. And CBA, of course, has always been the one predicting early rate cuts, and they've sort of kicked it out. But they're still saying this year. Thoughts on that? And I just might put this slide up. This is the latest 2-year. This is the 2-year bond. So it's at 4.009. It's above 4% at the moment, which is going the wrong way if you think that that's a proxy for the cash rate over the next forward period. So what's your take on the inflation story and what's going to happen?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to get a rate cut this year. My business partner, Dave, thinks we will. I don't think we will. And I think the reason for that is the strong jobs data that we had last week. And actually, if you don't mind, Martin, just quickly, I've created a chart on this, a slide, so might as well, I'll just run over it quickly. But I actually think the Albanese government's actually shot itself in the foot here. So the reason why Australia's had this strong jobs data and the unemployment rates remained 4.1% or whatever it is effectively because of these government type jobs. So I think it's called government aligned jobs, non-market jobs, and they principally relate to the NDIS. So as we know, the NDIS was introduced in about 2016, I think it was, and it has grown at a compound rate of about 20% per annum, and that's the chart on the left. So currently, it's almost worth about $50 billion a year. So it's creeping up towards 50 billion. The Parliamentary Budget Office reckons it's going to hit about 100 billion within a decade, which would put it on par with the age pension. So we're talking an enormous amount of money here. And the bottom left chart there comes from Westpac, and it shows that the public spending share of the economy hit a record high of 28% in the June quarter, and Westpac reckons it's going to keep rising. Sorry, 27.3, and they reckon it's going to keep rising. And the charts on the right show that basically Australia's jobs growth has come from this healthcare and social assistance sector, or principally the NDIS, so disability carers and that sort of thing. And the chart on the bottom right actually compares Australia's healthcare and social assistance employment against comparable countries. And you can see that Australia is just an outlier here. So Australia, we have 15% of our workforce is healthcare and social assistance. The big growth in that has been disability carers, which is shown in the top right. And we've got some great charts here from Justin Farber at Antipode and Macro. And what it showed is that around 70% of the jobs growth in the past year has been in these government-aligned sector, principally NDIS. So the reason why it's called government aligned is they can be private sector providers, but they're dependent on government spending. So, for example, if you run a disability company, which is a privately owned company, but you're relying on NDIS spending, it's effectively government aligned, right? So 70% of those non-market jobs, 70% of Australia's jobs growth in the last year has come from the non-market government aligned sector. And even worse, and this is the real damning thing, Australia's hours worked across the economy has risen 1.5% over the past year. So we're talking about the year to September here. Literally 100% of that growth in hours worked has come from the non-market government aligned sector. So effectively, we have a private sector, which despite the fact we've had 2.3% population growth in the year to September, has had 0 hours work growth. And what that tells you is that the private sector is effectively in a deep recession. And we sort of know that from the per capita data. But we've got this artificially supported employment market and artificially low unemployment rate because of the NDIS spending. And in some ways, it's perverse, but this NDIS spending is effectively going to scuttle the RBA from, it's going to it's going to thwart the RBA from being able to reduce interest rates because it's pumping up the economy. And this is actually fatal for Labor because Labor desperately needs the Reserve Bank of Australia to cut interest rates before the upcoming election, which has to be held by May next year. So the Labor government's got to race against the clock, hoping the RBA cuts interest rates before the election. But it's spending on the NDIS and these government jobs is actually preventing the RBA from cutting interest rates because it's keeping the economy, it's pumping up the economy. So as Tarek Brooker would say, we've got a burnout economy. That's his term, which basically means, the federal spending as, the government's got the foot on the accelerator through excessive federal spending, excessive immigration, all those sorts of things, while the RBA's got the foot planted on the brakes with interest rates. And because the federal government's got this foot on the accelerator, the RBA can't cut rates. And I think because of that, we're probably not going to get a rate cut until February. That being said, I think the inflation's actually going to, I wouldn't be surprised at all if underlying inflation's at the top of the RBA's band by the end of the year. On October 31, so next week when we get the CPI, the Q3 CPI. But even if it does come in at 3%, the underlying inflation I'm talking about here, I still think the RBA will hold because of the strength in the labour market, and it'd be concerned about this the economy is actually strengthening, if you look at the unemployment data, when it was hoping that it was actually softening. And this all gets down back to the NDIS effectively. So I think that's why we're probably going to get a rate cut in February, although my business partner Dave still reckons they're going to cut in December, but I don't think they will. And in some ways, I want them to cut in December because I think in November or December last year, I tipped that the RBA would cut rates in the second half. So purely for that reason, just so I can say I was right, I want to see them cut in December, but realistically, I think because of this strong jobs data, because of the NDIS, I think they're probably going to wait till, we probably won't see a cut till February, but who knows? I mean, if we magically get a very, very, very good inflation result and underlying inflation comes in at, undershoots big time and we get a 2.3% annual inflation or something like that, the RBA could then cut, but I think that's pretty unlikely.
Yeah, well, Andrew Hawser, the deputy, came out very recently and said, not in the short term, but we'll see.
So did Michelle Bullock.
Yeah. And I guess the other unknown factor here is the US election, which is just a couple of weeks away now, whether that will have any impact on the global economy. I mean, bond rates are moving up, not just in Australia, but in other countries too. And some people are attributing that to the bets on how this is going to play out in the US. So it's worth, I think, underscoring that our own economy is not completely isolated from what's going on around the world. And whilst bond rates did come down quite a long way, they've sort of climbed a little bit higher up again now, and that could be another little bit of a factor in the story. The bottom line, of course, is a lot of people are really, really struggling with their cash flow, and they need that rate cut. Albo needs a rate cut for the election, which is probably going to be May next year. That thing he's got to go by then, pretty much. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. But I come back to this fundamental point. The policy settings have been wrong for a long, long time now, and yet they're doubling down on actually doing more dumb things rather than actually tackling the real things, focusing on the announceables and, sounding as though they're doing great things and sounding as though the momentum in the housing market will save the economy. I'm skeptical. I don't think that any of the things that are actually being thrown around at the moment are actually turning in the right direction.
No, I agree. I mean, I think if and when the RBA does cut rates, we'll get a little bit of a credit-induced bounce. But basically, I still think the economy is on this stagflationary trajectory, basically, whereby we're going to have who knows, could be decades of really anemic, at least per capita growth, and living standards are going to, at least in a material economic sense, are going to flatline, and they're going to go backwards once you factor in the broader things that aren't captured in GDP, like housing quality and congestion and all this other stuff. And really, there's no, like, Australia's economy is really a productivity-free zone. I don't know if I've got enough time, but I did have some charts on I think I went through it before, didn't I, on productivity. And, the problem we've got is we're effectively we're leveraging into these government-aligned jobs, and we're also leveraging into high immigration, and both of those are disastrous for productivity. So on the left-hand side, I'll just run through these quickly. I know I don't want to take up too much time, but the left-hand side, the top chart on the left comes from the Productivity Commission, and it shows that the non-market productivity, so this is the area where we're getting most of the jobs growth, like NDIS-type jobs, is actually, the lowest it's been in decades. So we've had absolute productivity collapse in the non-market area, and that's dragged down Australia's overall productivity. And then at the same time, the chart at the top right comes from Jared Minack, and it shows that Australia's suffered from capital shallowing. So that occurs when basically your population grows faster than the growth in business investment and infrastructure and those sorts of things. It means you get less capital per worker. And just to give a quick explanation of what that is. So imagine if you operated a cafe, right? And you've got one coffee machine and you've got two staff who make coffees using that coffee machine. Now, if those two staff can make 50 coffees in an hour and the owner decides to increase the number of staff to 4 to boost their coffee output, they're not going to make 100 coffees with those 4 staff, because those 4 staff are still sharing one coffee machine. They'll end up getting congestion. One will have to wait for the other one finish, they'll bump into each other, those sorts of things. That there's a real life example of capital shallowing, whereby you've increased the amount of labour, but you haven't increased the capital to go with that labour. And that's effectively what the Australian economy has been for the last 20 years. We've had this massive population growth, whereby the population has grown by about 8.4 million people this century, but we haven't had the corresponding, infrastructure and business investment to go with it. And as a result, Australia's productivity has declined. And this is shown clearly in the bottom right chart, which I put together, which plots the immigration rate in green. So that's a percentage growth in the population from immigration in the green against Australia's real per capita GDP growth and labour productivity growth, which is GDP per hour worked. And as you can see, when immigration was ramped up in the mid-2000s, we had falling productivity. And this goes against the consensus view, or the view of the Grattan Institute and all these charlatans who try and argue that immigration is good for productivity. And look, it could be if we had a smaller number and the migrants we got were very skilled. But unfortunately, we have excessive numbers whereby infrastructure and business investment can't keep up. So you have to get this capital shallowing effect. And also, it's not particularly skilled. They work in low skilled professions generally, etc. So they don't get paid that much and they're not as productive. So this is the problem Australia has. It's going to keep putting on a low productivity trajectory. We've got the non-market sector of the economy is going to keep growing, not just because of the NDIS. So I'm picking on the NDIS a bit, but if the NDIS grows to $100 billion as projected within 10 years, it doubles in size again in 10 years. We're going to have way more people working in the non-market sector, which is a low productivity sector. That's going to drag down overall productivity growth. And of course, that's got to be funded through taxation, right? So it's going to pull, create a deadweight loss elsewhere. And at the same time as the government wants to keep running a high immigration policy, which is going to lead to more capital shallowing because infrastructure and business investment simply won't keep up. And it certainly won't keep up when you have mobs like the New South Wales Productivity Commission saying that we've got to cut infrastructure spending to build more housing. So, this is the catch-22 situation Australia has itself in. It's got itself on the Ponzi economy train. And that is effectively a low productivity, low growth future, like low per capita growth future that Australia has set in store, which means that we're going to basically fall down the developed country rankings. And we're going to, I'm not saying we're not going to become a developing country, I don't think, but we're going to become effectively a poorer and poorer nation. When, as I said before, given that we have everything that the world needs except for oil, we should be the opposite. We should be the richest nation on earth. We should be Norway. We should be a giant Norway with a massive sovereign wealth fund and huge mineral riches. And we should be paying low taxes because we get so much taxation from minerals. We should be sharing that wealth. But instead, we're not. The multinational companies are gouging us. They're getting the gains. We then are diluting our mineral wealth through enormous amounts of immigration. So we've got to share, whatever extra company tax and et cetera we get from our exports, iron ore exports, et cetera, amongst more people. And this is effectively making us poorer per person. So this is the ridiculous economy we have. And the only reason why Australia still is high up in the wealth rankings is because we've got expensive housing. So, because our housing is some of the most expensive in the world, that then artificially inflates the amount of wealth we've got, even though it's not real wealth. I mean, if my house is worth about $2 million, supposedly, I'd be just as wealthy if it was worth $1 million because I'm still living here. If I paid half as much as I did and it took out half as big a mortgage and the house was worth half as much as it is now, I'd be better off because I wouldn't still have a mortgage. And I'm still living in the same house. It serves the same utility. And even better, my children wouldn't have to get gouged and be poorer for the rest of their lives because they'd then afford to be able to buy a house when it's their turn. Instead, they're going to be, have to tap me on the shoulder, have to give them heaps of money, and they're going to have a mega mortgage. So, it's not real wealth, even though I'm notionally wealthy because I have, a house that's worth way more than my mortgage. But it's not real wealth because I'd be living here regardless, and I'm planning to live here for decades to come. So it's not real wealth, but that's because of this fake housing wealth. Australians are classified as wealthy, yet is a nation wealthy when most of its young people can't afford to buy a house? Like, to me, that's not wealth. That's the opposite of wealth. It's to me, that means Australia is not a wealthy nation because its young people can't afford housing even if the average house price or the average per capita housing wealth is very high, if that makes sense.
Well, it's interesting because I've had a few people say to me, the conditions now where effectively people are having to pay more and more of their income for housing, in some cases, half people's income is going on the mortgage payment or on the rental payment in my data.
That's not wealth.
No. What it means is they're not actually doing other things like, spending as much. So consumption is going through the floor. We also know that the high energy costs means it's really hard for businesses to actually make things. And so we are seeing the number of small businesses who are actually falling over, rising for all sorts of reasons. And if you start looking at the sort of the fundamental parameters of how you help people to get into somewhere to live, and property should be somewhere to live rather than just an investment vehicle, in my view, and businesses and how you actually create more momentum. Now, if you can create more businesses, that's a productivity improvement. If you don't do that, then effectively productivity goes down the gurgler. So however you look at it, banking on high migration and property growth for the future of the country looks to me to be completely flawed. And yet, well, beyond that, I have to say the politicians seem to be pretty much bankrupt in terms of ideas and strategies and everything.
Yeah, I understand. And here's the thing, just to give an example here. So if you could have a house that's worth $500,000 and no mortgage, or you could have the identical house that's worth $1 million and a $400,000 mortgage, who's better off? So, the way they measure the wealth statistics, the person with the $1 million house and this $400,000 mortgage is wealthier than the person who owns an identical house that's $500,000 with no mortgage.
Yes.
But I'd argue that the person with the $500,000 house is far better off because they've got no mortgage. They're getting the same utility out of the house. It's identical. And they've got more free cash flow to do whatever they want. And, if the banks weren't lending that $400,000 for for that $1 million house that's identical to the $500,000 house, they could lend to businesses and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
But instead, we've got this situation, a Ponzi scheme, whereby we keep pumping up the value of our housing, and people are, yes, we're notionally, we're, in an accounting sense, wealthier, but effectively, huge amounts of our the nation's resources, the financial resources, are going into a non-productive asset. That if we had a more sane system, these banks, etc., would have to lend somewhere else, and they probably lend to businesses, and they'd be productive. But instead, we've skewed. Back in 1990, about 2/3 of bank lending was to businesses and 1/3 was to housing, and now it's swung the other way around. It's 2/3 to housing, 1/3 to businesses, roughly. I'm not including personal loans, but that's actually worse for the economy because we've got so much of the nation's financial resources going into something that's effectively non-productive, and we're just trading house cards with each other, and everyone's sitting with these huge debt loads to effectively do what we used to do 30 years ago without debt or with very low levels of debt. So it's just a dumb system. It's just a giant Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, it is, unfortunately, and I don't see any evidence from governments of either persuasion going off in a different direction. So we're going to see more of the same. Doesn't help, really. And we've come to the end of the show, I'm afraid. Leith, now, if people want to find out more about you and what you do, where are the best places to go for?
Okay, two places. Number one, macrobusiness.com.au. That's where I write, heaps of articles every day, do this sort of analysis, etc. That's the mothership. Also got a YouTube channel at Leith Vo, which I think when I spoke to you the first time, Martin, I just hit 1,000 subs, start of the year or whatever.
Yep.
It's now at 9,200 and something subs, so it's actually doing all right. But
right.
That YouTube channel is mostly just my interviews that I do, and I do one or two explainers a week, where I'll do like a 3-minute video on a topic, where I just basically talk to charts and whatever, and just give my view on try and break down an issue. So at Leith Vo, if you want to check out my YouTube channel, subscribe, all that usual stuff. And that's pretty much it. Macrobusiness.com.au and at Leithvo at YouTube. Thanks again.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much indeed for coming on my show. I really appreciate that. And, we always have a really good deep dive into some really, really important issues. And I think, the fact of the matter is we have to keep hitting the government over the head with this stuff, because it's only at the margins that these issues are being discussed. And of course, if the MAD bill were to come in, then it would be even harder to have these conversations. So really, really important that we sound off about this stuff, because the point is there are alternative policies that could be executed that would actually take us to a much more prosperous future. But it's not necessarily one that the current incumbents want to take us down. So that's the problem, really. Thank you, Leith. Really appreciate your time.
Man. Thanks,
and look forward to having you back on down the track. And I'll put the links and things for Macrobusiness and what have you below, because very important source of truth there too.
Thanks, Martin. Speak to you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye. There you go, folks. Hope you found that insightful and informative. And look forward to having Leith back on down the track. Next week, we're going to have a discussion about property transactions and whether you really need a real estate agent at all. Can you do it without? So check that out next week. Following week, we'll have Damien back on to talk about the markets again. So that's the plan. And next month, I've got Cameron coming back on to talk about some of his stuff. So got a few things going on. Thank you very much for spending time with us this evening. The dogs are still in their baskets, so that's good. So they've came and given me a nudge a couple of times, but apart from that, pretty good. And that's it. So thank you very much for spending some time with us. Thank you very much for all the super chats. Greatly appreciated, for all the comments and the banter in the chat there too. Please like and subscribe. And I'll look forward to seeing you on the live show next Tuesday. And the recorded shows will go up daily in the interim. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. We'll see you next time. Take care.